Every woman has felt that cold fear, walking alone at night, knowing predators lurk in shadows. For Nessa Tull, that nightmare becomes reality when she's dragged to a remote ranch by a giant cowboy who keeps women like livestock. Brock the ox stands 7 feet tall and has turned kidnapping into his twisted hobby. He chains his victims in a stone cellar, planning to use them for breeding and cooking. But Nessa carries something in her blood that he never expected. Strange things start happening on his ranch. Cattle die in perfect circles, wells turn black, and Nessa's eyes begin to glow with an ancient power. The land itself starts to rebel against this monster. What secret does this poor seamstress carry that can make the earth tremble and the dead rise? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Perdition Gulch, a town that seemed to exist in the forgotten corners of God's creation. Dust devils danced between weathered buildings that had seen better decades, their paint peeling like old scabs. The few residents who remained moved with the careful deliberation of people who had learned not to draw attention to themselves. They spoke in whispers when they spoke at all, casting nervous glances toward the hills where Brock Henley's ranch sprawled like a cancer across the landscape. Nessa Tull had arrived in this god-forsaken place 3 months ago with nothing but a carpet bag, a sewing kit, and her mother's tarnished silver locket pressed against her heart. The locket held a photograph so old the faces had faded to mere suggestions, but she cherished it as her only connection to a family she'd never really known. Her mother had died when Nessa was barely 5, taking with her all the stories and warnings that might have prepared her daughter for what was coming. At 28, Nessa had the weathered hands of someone who'd worked since childhood, but her eyes still held a spark that poverty hadn't quite extinguished. She'd set up shop in the back room of Widow Morrison's boarding house, mending clothes and altering dresses for the handful of women who could afford such luxuries. The work was honest, if sparse, and it kept food in her belly and a roof over her head. The widow had taken a motherly interest in the young seamstress, often bringing her tea and day-old biscuits while sharing the local gossip. It was during one of these visits that Nessa first heard the name that would change everything. "You stay away from the Henley place," Martha Morrison had warned, her gnarled fingers clutching her shawl tight. "That Brock, they call him the ox for good reason, 7 feet if he's an inch, with hands that could crush a man's skull like an eggshell." Nessa had nodded politely, focused on the delicate stitching of a communion dress. Such warnings seemed distant and unreal in the safety of her small room, with afternoon sunlight streaming through gingham curtains. "I mean it, child," the widow had continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Women go missing around these parts. Young ones, desperate ones. The kind nobody much notices when they're gone." She'd paused, studying Nessa's face with knowing eyes. "The kind like you." The truth was, people had been disappearing from Perdition Gulch for years. Sheriff Hawkins kept the official reports buried deep in his desk drawer, accepting the monthly payments that Brock delivered in cash-stuffed envelopes. Tom Hawkins had once been an honest lawman, but 20 years of disappointment and an empty whiskey bottle had worn down his moral compass until it spun wildly, always pointing toward the path of least resistance. Dr. Edgar Meridian knew the truth about those disappearances, though he tried his best to drown that knowledge in whatever bottle he could find. The town's only physician had examined enough unmarked graves to understand what was happening, but his medical license hung by a thread, and his courage had long since dissolved in alcohol. He'd been a different man once, fresh out of medical school with dreams of healing the frontier. Now he shambled through his days in a fog of regret and rot-gut whiskey, his hands too shaky for surgery and his conscience too numb for protest. 20 miles outside town, Brock Henley's ranch house squatted against the horizon like a monument to malevolence. The building itself defied easy description, part fortress, part slaughterhouse, with thick stone walls that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. Brock had inherited the land from his grandfather, along with certain family traditions that decent folk didn't discuss. At 43, Brock stood like a monument to brutality. His shoulders spanned the width of a doorframe, and his arms hung like sides of beef from a frame that nature had built for violence. His grandfather's stories had shaped him from childhood tales of taking what you wanted when you wanted it, without apology or explanation. The old man had taught him that some people were born to rule and others were born to serve, and the sooner everyone accepted their proper place, the better off they'd be. The ranch's outbuildings told their own dark story to anyone brave enough to read the signs. A stone cellar had been carved into the hillside behind the main house, its entrance secured with iron bars that belonged in a prison. Local contractors had built it according to Brock's exacting specifications, though none of them had asked why a rancher needed such a secure underground chamber. The smart ones hadn't wanted to know. Inside that cellar, the walls bore the scorch marks of Brock's custom branding iron. The tool itself was a work of twisted artistry, forged by a blacksmith who'd taken the secret of its design to his grave. The iron bore a symbol that looked like nothing so much as a serpent devouring its own tail, surrounded by angular marks that seemed to shift and change depending on the light. Brock had found the design in his grandfather's papers, sketched in a hand that trembled with either age or fear. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Nessa rose before dawn to catch the best light for her sewing, her fingers working automatically as she hemmed a child's Sunday dress. The rhythmic motion of needle through fabric had always calmed her mind, allowing her thoughts to drift and wander like smoke. She'd been thinking about her mother again, as she often did when working. The memories were fragments, mostly a woman's voice humming lullabies in a language Nessa didn't recognize, the scent of sage and something else she couldn't name, and always the weight of the silver locket against her chest. Sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, she could almost hear her mother's voice warning her about something important, but the words dissolved like morning mist, leaving only a sense of urgency she couldn't explain. The knock at her door came just after sunrise, sharp and insistent. Nessa set aside her work and opened it to find a man she didn't recognize, lean and nervous, with the look of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "Miss Tull?" He removed his hat, revealing hair slicked down with too much pomade. "Name's Jensen. I work for Mr. Henley out at the ranch. He's got need of a seamstress for some specialized work." Nessa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "I'm afraid I don't take work outside of town, Mr. Jensen." The man's smile was as thin as paper. "Mr. Henley anticipated you might say that. He's prepared to pay very well more than you'd make in 6 months doing alterations." He reached into his vest and produced a roll of bills thick enough to choke a horse. "Consider it an advance on services to be rendered." The money represented freedom from worry, from the constant calculation of whether she could afford both food and rent. It meant security in a world that offered precious little of either. Against every instinct screaming warnings in her head, Nessa found herself nodding. "What kind of specialized work?" she asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. "Custom garments," Jensen replied, his eyes avoiding hers. "Mr. Henley has particular requirements. He'll explain everything when you arrive." Within the hour, Nessa found herself in the back of Jensen's wagon, her sewing supplies packed in a leather satchel beside her. The man had insisted she bring everything: needles, thread, scissors, measuring tape, and patterns. "You'll be staying at the ranch for the duration of the work," he'd explained when she protested. "Mr. Henley prefers to oversee such projects personally." As they rolled through the dusty streets of Perdition Gulch, Nessa caught sight of Dr. Meridian stumbling out of the saloon, his shirt stained and his eyes red-rimmed with drink and desperation. For just a moment, their gazes met through the wagon's canvas cover, and she saw something flicker across his face: recognition, fear, and what might have been pity. He opened his mouth as if to call out, then seemed to think better of it, and turned away, disappearing into an alley between 2 crumbling buildings. The ride to the Henley Ranch took the better part of 3 hours, winding through increasingly desolate country where nothing seemed to grow quite right. The grass was too yellow, the trees too stunted, and the few animals they passed seemed skittish and wrong somehow. Even Jensen's horses grew nervous as they approached the property, their ears flat and their eyes rolling white. When the ranch house finally came into view, Nessa felt her mother's locket grow cold against her skin, as if the silver itself recoiled from whatever waited ahead. The building looked like a fortress, built by someone who expected to be under siege, its windows narrow and defensive, its walls thick enough to muffle screams. Brock himself emerged from the main house as they approached, and Nessa understood immediately why they called him the Ox. He moved with the deliberate weight of something that had never learned to fear anything smaller than itself. His smile was all teeth and no warmth, and when he spoke, his voice carried the rumble of distant thunder. "Miss Tull," he said, reaching up to help her down from the wagon. "Welcome to my home." His hands, when they touched hers, were as large as dinner plates and rough as tree bark. But it was the temperature that made her gasp. They were cold as winter stone, as if no blood flowed beneath that sun-weathered skin. "I hope the journey wasn't too taxing," Brock continued, his pale eyes studying her with the intensity of a man appraising livestock. "Jensen tells me you're quite skilled with needle and thread." "I do my best, Mr. Henley," Nessa managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Though I confess I'm curious about these custom garments you mentioned." Brock's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp and too numerous. "All in good time, Miss Tull. All in good time. First, let me show you to your quarters. I think you'll find them quite secure." As he led her toward the stone cellar behind the main house, Nessa's locket seemed to pulse against her heart like a second heartbeat, and somewhere in the distance she could swear she heard the sound of women weeping. The stone cellar was everything Nessa's nightmares had never dared imagine. Carved directly into the hillside, it stretched back into darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. Iron bars sectioned off individual cells, and the air hung thick with the scent of fear and something else, something old and angry that made her skin crawl. Brock's massive frame filled the doorway as he gestured for her to enter. "Your workshop," he announced with the pride of a man showing off his finest achievement. "I think you'll find it has everything you need." The first thing Nessa noticed was that she wasn't alone. 3 other women huddled in the shadows of separate cells, their eyes hollow with despair and something worse, resignation. They looked at her with the pity of those who had already accepted their fate, women who had learned that hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. "The previous seamstresses," Brock explained casually, as if discussing livestock. "They proved inadequate for my purposes. I trust you'll demonstrate more skill." As her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the single-barred window, Nessa began to make out details that turned her blood to ice. Scorch marks decorated the walls in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and chains hung from iron rings driven deep into the stone. In one corner, she spotted what looked like a workbench, but the stains covering its surface told a story she didn't want to read. Brock guided her to the largest cell, its door standing open like a mouth, waiting to swallow her whole. "Your accommodations," he said, his voice carrying mock courtesy. "I've taken the liberty of providing some materials you might find interesting." Inside the cell, beyond a rough straw mattress and a bucket that served purposes she didn't want to contemplate, something caught her eye. Wedged between 2 stones in the far wall, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, was what appeared to be a small piece of carved bone. "I'll leave you to settle in," Brock continued, his pale eyes never leaving her face. "Dinner will be served shortly, and then we'll discuss your first assignment." The moment the cell door clanged shut, Nessa felt the weight of her situation crash down like a falling tree. The locket at her throat seemed to grow heavier, its silver surface warming against her skin in a way that defied the cellar's chill. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and tried to steady her breathing, but panic clawed at her chest like a living thing. "Don't let him see you cry," whispered a voice from the next cell. The woman who spoke was perhaps 30, though hardship had aged her beyond her years. Her dark hair hung in matted tangles, and her clothes, what remained of them, told the story of long captivity. "He feeds on fear, makes him stronger somehow. How long have you been here?" Nessa asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Time stops meaning much after the first month," the woman replied. "I'm Maria Santos, was traveling through when he took me. That was, well, could be 6 months now, maybe more." From another cell came a bitter laugh. "Try 2 years," called a blonde woman whose once fine dress had been reduced to rags. "Sarah Mitchell. I was running from a bad marriage when the ox decided I'd run right into something worse." The third woman said nothing, rocking slowly in the corner of her cell. Maria noticed Nessa's concerned look and shook her head sadly. "Jenny's been here longest. She doesn't talk much anymore. Breaks your heart to see what he's done to her spirit." As if summoned by their conversation, heavy footsteps echoed down the stone corridor. Brock returned, carrying a tray of what passed for food: stale bread, thin gruel, and water that tasted of rust and despair. He slid the meal through the bars with the mechanical efficiency of long practice. "Now then, Miss Tull," he said, settling his massive frame onto a wooden stool that creaked under his weight. "Let's discuss your work requirements." He reached into his coat and withdrew a bundle of fabric that made Nessa's stomach lurch. The material was stained with substances she didn't want to identify, and it had been cut and shaped into a garment that belonged in a madman's fever dream. "Wedding dresses," Brock explained, his voice taking on an almost dreamy quality. "Each one custom-fitted for its intended bride. I have very specific traditions, you understand. Family customs that must be observed." The horror of his meaning hit her like a physical blow. This monster intended to force marriage on his captives before she couldn't complete the thought. Her hand went instinctively to her mother's locket, and she felt the silver pulse with sudden warmth. "The previous seamstresses lacked vision," Brock continued, apparently oblivious to her revulsion. "They created merely functional garments. I require something more, ceremonial, something worthy of the occasion." When she could trust her voice to remain steady, Nessa asked, "What happened to them? The other seamstresses?" Brock's smile was all teeth and cruelty. "They outlived their usefulness. I trust you'll prove more durable." That night, after Brock had returned to the main house and the cellar fell into uneasy quiet, Nessa examined the bone fragment she'd spotted earlier. Working carefully in the darkness, she managed to work it free from its hiding place. The moment her fingers closed around it, she gasped. The bone was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the dim light. It was hollow, a whistle of some kind, and the moment she touched it to her lips, a sound emerged that no earthly instrument should have been able to produce. The note was low and mournful, like wind through a canyon. But underneath it ran something else, voices, calling across vast distances, speaking words in a language her mind didn't recognize, but her blood somehow understood. The effect on the cellar was immediate and startling. The other women looked up from their despair, their eyes suddenly alert and focused. Even poor Jenny stopped her rocking and turned toward the sound with something approaching awareness. But more disturbing was what happened outside their prison. Through the small window, Nessa could see the ranch yard, and she watched in amazement as Brock's cattle began to move in strange patterns, forming circles that hurt to look at directly. The animals' eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their movements seemed choreographed by some intelligence beyond their own. "What is that thing?" Maria whispered, pressing against the bars that separated their cells. "I don't know," Nessa admitted, though that wasn't entirely true. Deep in her bones, in the part of her that remembered her mother's lullabies and the weight of old warnings, she knew exactly what the whistle was: a calling device, something meant to wake powers that had been sleeping too long. The bone grew warm in her hand, and suddenly she could hear her grandmother's voice as clearly as if the old woman stood beside her. "When the time comes, Mija, you'll know what to do. The blood remembers, even when the mind forgets." Outside, the wind began to howl with voices that sounded almost human, and Nessa felt something stir in her chest, not fear this time, but something older and far more dangerous. The locket at her throat pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and she realized with growing certainty that whatever was happening to her had been set in motion long before she'd ever heard the name Brock Henley. As if sensing the change in the air, Brock's voice echoed from the main house, a roar of confusion and rage that sent chills down her spine. Something was wrong with his perfect little kingdom of horror, and somehow she was the cause. The bone whistle had awakened something that had been sleeping in her blood, something that had been waiting for this moment. As Maria and the others watched in amazement, Nessa felt power flowing through her veins like liquid fire, and she knew with absolute certainty that the hunter was about to discover what it felt like to become the hunted. The rope binding Nessa's wrists had been ordinary hemp when Brock first secured it, but by morning it had become something else entirely. The fibers seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, and where they touched her skin, they left marks that looked less like rope burn and more like ancient tattoos, spiraling patterns that seemed to tell a story in a language written in flesh and pain. Brock noticed the change when he brought their morning meal, his pale eyes narrowing as he studied the transformed bindings. When he reached through the bars to examine the rope more closely, it began to smoke where his fingers made contact, forcing him to jerk his hand back with a curse that echoed through the stone chamber. "What kind of witch are you?" he snarled. But underneath his anger, Nessa detected something she'd never expected to hear in his voice: uncertainty. "I don't know what you mean," she replied honestly, though the rope seemed to tighten and loosen around her wrists as if responding to her emotions. "I'm just a seamstress." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were no longer entirely true. The bone whistle had awakened something in her blood, and that something was growing stronger by the hour. She could feel it moving through her like warm honey, changing her in ways she couldn't yet understand. Maria had been watching the exchange with growing excitement. Once Brock retreated to the main house, she leaned as close to Nessa's cell as the bars would allow. "My grandmother told stories," she whispered urgently, "about women who carried the old blood. Women who could make the earth itself their ally." "Stories aren't real," Nessa protested, but her conviction wavered as the rope around her wrists pulsed in response to her heartbeat. "Aren't they?" Maria gestured toward the small window that offered their only view of the outside world. "Look at his cattle." Nessa followed her gaze and gasped. Brock's prize herd, which had grazed peacefully for as long as anyone could remember, now lay scattered across the pasture in perfect geometric patterns. From their elevated position in the cellar, the arrangement was clearly visible, circles within circles, with lines connecting them in ways that hurt to contemplate. Most disturbing of all, the animals weren't just lying down, they were dead, their bodies arranged with mathematical precision by forces unknown. "It started when you played that whistle," Maria continued. "Whatever's in your blood, it's calling to things that have been sleeping in this land for a long time." Throughout the day, more signs of disturbance manifested around the ranch. Brock's few remaining hired hands, men who had been willing to ignore certain irregularities in exchange for better-than-average wages, began to experience dreams that drove them from their beds screaming. By afternoon, 3 of them had simply walked away from the ranch, leaving their belongings behind and refusing to explain their sudden departure. Sheriff Hawkins arrived just before sunset, his usual swagger notably absent as he surveyed the dead cattle and spoke in hushed tones with Brock near the main house. Even from their prison, the women could hear the tension in their voices, though the specific words were lost to distance. "Tom's scared," Sarah observed from her cell. She'd been watching the sheriff through the window with the sharp attention of someone whose survival had once depended on reading men's moods. I've seen that look before. He knows something bad is coming, but he's too deep in Brock's pocket to do anything about it. Dr. Meridian arrived an hour later, summoned by Brock to examine the dead cattle. The physician's hands shook worse than usual as he conducted his examination, and even through their stone walls they could hear him retching as he worked. When he emerged from the pasture, his face was white as cemetery marble, and he refused Brock's offer of payment before stumbling back toward town. That evening, Brock descended into the cellar with his branding iron in hand. The custom tool gleamed dully in the lamplight, its serpentine design seeming to writhe in the dancing shadows. He'd come to mark Nessa as his property, to begin the twisted rituals that had claimed so many women before her. But when he lit the brazier to heat the iron, nothing happened. The coals remained cold and black, refusing to catch fire despite his increasingly desperate efforts. The iron itself seemed to resist his touch, growing heavier with each attempt until he could barely lift it. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice cracking with frustration and something approaching panic. Nessa looked up from where she sat against the far wall of her cell, the bone whistle hidden in her palm and the rope around her wrists glowing with subtle inner light. "I haven't done anything," she said quietly, "but maybe someone else has." As if summoned by her words, the wind outside began to howl with voices that sounded disturbingly human. The temperature in the cellar dropped precipitously, and frost began forming on the stone walls, despite the late summer heat that had baked the earth all day. Brock backed toward the cellar entrance, his massive frame trembling like a child's. "This isn't over," he snarled, but his voice carried none of its usual conviction. "I'll find a way to break whatever spell you've cast." After he left, locking the heavy door behind him, the four women sat in contemplative silence. Jenny, who hadn't spoken in months, suddenly raised her head and looked directly at Nessa. When she spoke, her voice was rusty from disuse but surprisingly strong. "The land remembers," she said simply. "It remembers what was taken and what was owed. You're not the first to carry the debt, but you might be the one who finally pays it." Before Nessa could ask what she meant, Jenny retreated back into her silence, leaving them with more questions than answers. But as the night deepened and strange lights began dancing across the ranch, Nessa began to understand that she was part of something much larger than her own survival. The rope around her wrists had become warm now, almost comforting in its pulsing rhythm. Whatever power flowed through it was growing stronger, and she could feel it calling to similar forces buried deep in the earth beneath the ranch. Forces that had been waiting patiently for justice, for someone with the right blood to wake them from their long slumber. In the distance, she could hear Brock pacing the floors of his house, his heavy footsteps echoing like thunder. But for the first time since arriving at this place of horrors, Nessa wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Instead, she found herself curious about what other surprises her awakening heritage might reveal. The bone whistle grew warm in her palm, and she smiled. Memory came to Nessa in fragments that night, pieces of her childhood reassembling themselves like a puzzle made of dreams and shadow. She saw her grandmother's weathered hands, mixing ingredients that belonged in no ordinary kitchen, sage and tobacco, ground bones and herbs that grew only in places where blood had been spilled. The old woman's voice echoed across the years, speaking words in a language that sounded like wind through canyon stones. "Recuerda, mija," her grandmother whispered from beyond the veil of years. "Remember what I taught you. The recipes are more than food, they are medicine for the soul, protection for the innocent, and justice for the wronged." As dawn broke over the ranch, Nessa found herself reciting ingredients and measurements she had no conscious memory of learning. Recipes for healing broths and protective wards, instructions for calling spirits and binding curses, knowledge that had been sleeping in her blood until the bone whistle awakened it. Maria watched with growing excitement as Nessa began drawing patterns in the dirt floor of her cell, her fingers moving with the certainty of long practice despite her conscious bewilderment. The designs seemed to glow with their own inner light, and wherever Nessa's touch lingered, small plants began to sprout from the barren earth. "My grandmother was curandera," Maria whispered, pressing close to the bars that separated them. "She taught me to recognize the signs. You're not just awakening to your power, you're remembering it." The plants growing around Nessa's cell were unlike anything that should have been able to survive in the stone cellar's harsh environment. They formed precise geometric patterns, their leaves and flowers creating symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. Some bore thorns sharp as needles, while others exuded fragrances that made the stale air smell of spring meadows and clean rain. By mid-morning, the supernatural disturbances had spread beyond the ranch boundaries. Dr. Meridian stumbled into his office to find his medical texts rearranged on their shelves, organized now not by subject, but in patterns that told stories of old wounds and older remedies. His hands steadier than they'd been in years, he began reading about treatments that had been forgotten for generations, healing methods that combined conventional medicine with practices his university training had never acknowledged. Meanwhile, Brock's remaining ranch hands reported increasingly disturbing incidents. Tools moved on their own during the night, rearranging themselves into configurations that served no practical purpose but created an overwhelming sense of unease. The well water turned brackish, then clear, then brackish again, as if something deep underground was testing its strength against pipes and pumps. Most unsettling of all, the horses had begun to speak. Not with human voices, but with sounds that carried meaning beyond mere animal communication. They spoke of riders who had passed through generations ago, of women taken in the night, of promises made in blood and broken in worse ways. The ranch hands who heard these equine testimonies found themselves unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to do anything but pack their belongings and flee toward town. Brock himself had barricaded himself in the main house, his massive frame reduced to pacing the length of his parlor like a caged animal. He'd tried everything he could think of to reassert control, threatening the women, attempting to heat his branding iron with different fires, even praying to a god he'd abandoned long ago. Nothing worked. The ranch was slipping away from him, transforming into something that obeyed laws older than human law. In the cellar, Jenny had begun to speak more frequently, her words carrying the weight of prophecy. "The cookbook was her grandmother's," she said, nodding toward Nessa. "Passed down through women who knew how to turn food into medicine, medicine into protection, protection into power." Sarah leaned forward, her businessman's mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. "You're talking about magic, real magic. I'm talking about knowledge," Jenny replied. "Knowledge that some people called magic because they couldn't understand it. Knowledge that got women burned as witches when they used it to protect their families and communities." As if responding to Jenny's words, Nessa felt more memories surface her mother, teaching her to dry herbs in specific patterns, to combine ingredients according to phases of the moon, to speak words of blessing over meals that would nourish more than just the body. The recipes had seemed like folklore then, quaint traditions kept alive, more from sentiment than belief. Now she understood they were instructions for survival. The rope around her wrists had begun to change again, its hemp fibers transforming into something that looked more like woven light than ordinary material. Where it touched her skin, new patterns appeared, not burns or scars, but markings that seemed to be written from the inside out, as if her very bones were inscribing themselves on her flesh. Dr. Meridian appeared at the cellar window just before noon, his face pressed against the bars as he studied the women with eyes that held more clarity than they'd shown in years. "I remember now," he called down to them. "I remember the stories my grandmother told about women like you, women who could call the dead from their graves and make the earth itself an ally." Brock's voice roared from the main house, a sound of rage and frustration that set the windows rattling. Whatever control he'd once maintained over his little kingdom of horrors was crumbling, and everyone could feel it. The very air seemed lighter, as if a crushing weight was slowly being lifted. "He knows he's losing," Maria observed with satisfaction. The land is rejecting him, just like it should have done years ago. As the day wore on, more changes manifested throughout the ranch. The barn doors swung open on their own, revealing stalls that had been converted into holding cells. The sight of chains and shackles bolted to the walls told a story that made even hardened witnesses sick to their stomachs. But now those instruments of torment began to rust and crumble, falling apart as if accelerated time was reclaiming them. In the kitchen garden behind the main house, plants began growing in patterns that spelled out words in a dozen different languages, all of them accusations, all of them demands for justice. The vegetables and herbs intertwined to form messages that could be read from the cellar window, testimonies from women who had suffered and died at Brock's hands. As evening approached, Nessa felt the full weight of her inheritance settling around her shoulders like a mantle woven from moonlight and memory. She was no longer just a seamstress caught in a monster's web. She was the inheritor of generations of wisdom, the vessel for justice that had been too long delayed. The bone whistle pulsed warm in her palm, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of drums that beat in rhythm with her heart. The cattle brand hanging in Brock's workshop had been forged by his grandfather 40 years earlier, designed according to specifications found in the old man's war journals. For decades, it had remained unchanged, a simple design that marked the Henley livestock as family property. But as the supernatural disturbances intensified around the ranch, the brand began to transform. Dr. Meridian was the first to notice the change when he ventured into Brock's workshop that morning, drawn by scientific curiosity and liquid courage in equal measure. The iron tool that had once borne the simple H of the Henley family now displayed symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the lamplight. Angular marks surrounded what looked like a coiled serpent, and beneath it all, new characters had appeared, symbols that belonged to no alphabet he recognized, but that somehow conveyed meaning anyway. "My God," he whispered, his hands shaking as he examined the transformed brand. "It's Cherokee. These are Cherokee warning symbols." The revelation sent him stumbling back toward town, his mind racing with implications he was still too afraid to fully accept. In his office, he pulled out medical journals and historical texts, searching for anything that might explain what he was witnessing. What he found in the dusty pages of local history books made his blood run cold. The land where Brock's ranch now stood had once been the site of a Cherokee settlement, a peaceful community that had existed for generations before the coming of European settlers. According to military records that Dr. Meridian had never bothered to read before, the settlement had been wiped out in 1838 by a cavalry unit led by Captain Samuel Henley Brock's great-grandfather. The records were clinical in their brutality. 53 women and children murdered in what the official report called a necessary action to secure the frontier. Meridian could see the truth that military bureaucracy had tried to sanitize. This had been a massacre, pure and simple, carried out against defenseless people whose only crime had been living on land that white men wanted. Most disturbing of all were the personal notes that Captain Henley had included with his official report, describing in detail how the Cherokee women had cursed his family line with their dying breaths. The old soldier had dismissed such talk as savage superstition, but his private writings revealed a man increasingly troubled by nightmares and strange occurrences. In the cellar, Nessa felt the weight of this history settling into her bones like winter cold. The transformed cattle brand was broadcasting its message across distances that had nothing to do with physical space, calling to spirits that had been waiting for justice since the day they died. She could hear their voices now, speaking in the Cherokee language her grandmother had whispered in lullabies she'd never understood. "The brand is telling the truth now," Maria observed, pressing her face against the window to get a better look at the workshop. All those years, it carried the lie that this land belonged to the Henley family. Now, it's telling the real story. The supernatural manifestations had begun to organize themselves into patterns that told a coherent narrative. In the pastures where Brock's cattle had died, new growth appeared overnight, not grass or wildflowers, but corn and beans and squash planted in the traditional Three Sisters formation that Cherokee farmers had used for generations. The plants grew with impossible speed, reaching maturity in hours rather than months, their presence a declaration that this land remembered its true children. Around the main house, the very foundations began to shift and settle, revealing the post holes and fire pits of the original Cherokee settlement. Artifacts buried for nearly a century pushed their way to the surface: pottery shards, stone tools, and most significantly, bones. The remains of the massacre victims had been hastily buried by Captain Henley's men, but now they demanded proper recognition. Sheriff Hawkins arrived at the ranch just after noon, summoned by increasingly frantic messages from Brock. The lawman's usual swagger had been replaced by the careful movements of someone who knew he was walking on unstable ground. He'd spent the morning fielding reports from terrified townspeople who claimed to see Cherokee warriors walking the streets of Perdition Gulch, translucent figures who pointed accusingly at anyone who met their gaze. "This has to stop, Brock," Hawkins said, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. "The whole town's going crazy. People are talking about calling in the territorial government." Brock emerged from his barricaded house, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and something approaching madness. "You think I don't want it to stop?" he snarled. "You think I'm doing this on purpose?" The sheriff gestured toward the cellar where the women were imprisoned. "Let them go, Brock. Whatever's happening here, it started when you brought that seamstress. Send them all back to town and maybe—" "I can't." Brock's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you understand? If I let them go now, they'll tell everyone what I've done. What we've done. Your monthly payments. Tom, where do you think people will assume that money came from?" The accusation hung in the air between them like a poisonous cloud. Sheriff Hawkins had known, on some level, what those cash payments represented. He'd chosen willful ignorance over moral courage, and now that choice was coming back to haunt him in ways he'd never imagined. In the cellar, the four women could hear every word of the conversation through the stone walls. Jenny had become increasingly lucid as the supernatural activity intensified, and now she spoke with the clarity of someone whose mind had been cleared of fog. "He's trapped," she observed. "Brock can't let us go because we know too much, but keeping us here is what's causing all this. He's made himself the focal point of a curse that's been waiting 80 years to fulfill itself." Sarah nodded grimly. "A businessman's nightmare, trapped in a deal that's destroying him, but unable to back out because the exit costs are too high." As if responding to their analysis, the transformed cattle brand in the workshop began to glow with its own inner light. The Cherokee symbols seemed to pulse in rhythm with heartbeats that belonged to women who had died long before any of them were born, and the coiled serpent design began to move, its metal form writhing like a living thing. Dr. Meridian, still researching in his office, found references to Cherokee prophecies about the return of the dead. According to the fragments he could piece together, the Cherokee believed that great injustices created spiritual debts that accumulated interest across generations. When the debt became too large to ignore, the dead would return to collect what was owed with compound interest that took the form of supernatural retribution. As evening approached, the ranch had become a nexus where past and present converged. The Cherokee settlement was rebuilding itself through supernatural means, overlaying its ghostly structures on Brock's buildings like a double-exposed photograph. The workshop, where he'd tortured so many women, now shared its space with a Cherokee medicine lodge, and the cattle brand that had marked his property now served as a beacon, calling the spirits home. In her cell, Nessa felt the final pieces of her heritage clicking into place. She wasn't just a descendant of Cherokee women, she was the inheritor of their sacred duty to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. The bone whistle in her palm had become warm as living flesh, and the rope around her wrists pulsed with power that grew stronger with each passing hour. The time for passive resistance was ending. Soon, it would be time for justice. The sacred tobacco pouch materialized in Nessa's cell just before midnight, appearing between one breath and the next, as if the stone walls themselves had given birth to it. The leather was soft with age and decorated with beadwork that told stories in colors that seemed to shift and change in the dim light. When Nessa's fingers closed around it, she felt the weight of generations, not just of the tobacco itself, but of all the prayers and ceremonies it had witnessed. Maria recognized the significance immediately. "Tobacco sagrado," she whispered reverently. "My grandmother always said it was the bridge between the living and the dead." With trembling fingers, Nessa opened the pouch and breathed in the rich, earthy scent that rose from within. This wasn't ordinary tobacco. It carried the essence of something far older and more powerful. As she pinched a small amount between her fingers, knowledge flooded through her like water through a broken dam. She knew, without being taught, that the tobacco had been blessed by Cherokee medicine women before the massacre. She knew that it had been hidden away, waiting for the right descendant to claim it. Most importantly, she knew exactly how to use it to communicate with the spirits that had been trying to reach her since the moment she'd blown the bone whistle. The ritual came to her as naturally as breathing. She formed the tobacco into a small mound on the stone floor, then whispered words in Cherokee that her conscious mind had never learned. When she touched the bone whistle to the tobacco, both items began to glow with soft, golden light. The smoke that rose from the sacred offering was unlike anything the physical world should have been able to produce. It moved with purpose rather than following air currents, forming shapes and symbols that conveyed meaning beyond language. As the other women watched in amazement, the smoke began to coalesce into human forms, translucent figures that bore the faces of Cherokee women who had died protecting their children 80 years ago. "Granddaughter," spoke a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The figure who addressed Nessa bore features that echoed her own, though the woman had died decades before her birth. "We have been waiting." The spirit's presence filled the cellar with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Other figures began to appear, women of various ages, all bearing the marks of violence, but radiating a strength that death had been unable to diminish. They formed a circle around Nessa's cell, their ghostly forms more substantial with each passing moment. "Tell me what I need to do," Nessa whispered, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," her ancestor replied. "The debt must be paid." The circle closed. "You are the vessel we have chosen, the hand that will balance the scales." Through the sacred smoke, the spirits began to share their memories not just of their own deaths, but of all the women who had suffered at Henley's hands across 3 generations. Nessa saw Captain Henley's original crimes in vivid detail, watched as he passed his twisted appetites down to his son, who in turn corrupted his own boy. The pattern had repeated with each generation, getting worse rather than better, until Brock represented the festering culmination of inherited evil. But the visions showed her something else as well, the Cherokee belief in balance, in the idea that all things must eventually return to harmony. The massacre had created a spiritual wound in the land itself, a tear in the fabric of justice that had been growing wider with each new atrocity. Now, finally, the cosmic scales were ready to be balanced. As the tobacco smoke swirled around them, Maria felt her own heritage awakening in response to the Cherokee magic. Her grandmother's curandera knowledge rose to the surface, allowing her to understand and interpret the spiritual energies flowing through the cellar. She began to chant in Spanish, her words weaving protection spells around all 4 women. "Animas benditas," she whispered, calling upon blessed souls to witness what was happening. "Protejan a estas mujeres, que la justicia se servida." The combination of Cherokee spirit work and Mexican folk magic created something new and powerful. The two traditions, both rooted in respect for the sacred and the understanding that justice transcends death, merged into a force that made the very stones of the cellar hum with energy. Outside their prison, the effects were immediate and dramatic. The ranch house began to shake as if gripped by an earthquake, though the tremors followed no natural pattern. Windows cracked in geometric designs that told stories of violence and retribution, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that frost formed on every surface despite the summer heat. Brock, still barricaded in his parlor, felt the change like a physical blow. The walls around him began to bleed, not red blood, but something darker and older that spoke of debts unpaid and promises broken. He could hear voices now, speaking Cherokee words that his great-grandfather had tried to forget, and Spanish prayers that called down divine justice on his family line. Dr. Meridian, working through the night in his office, felt the spiritual earthquake as well. His medical instruments began to move on their own, arranging themselves into patterns that resembled Cherokee medicine wheels. The bottles of laudanum and whiskey that had been his constant companions for years suddenly tasted like ash, their numbing effects no longer able to quiet the voices of the dead. In the cellar, Sarah and Jenny watched in amazement as Nessa's transformation accelerated. The sacred tobacco smoke had awakened something fundamental in her DNA, activating genetic memories that had been dormant for generations. Her eyes began to glow with the same golden light as the tobacco, and the patterns on her skin spread until she looked like a living map of Cherokee spiritual geography. "The spirits are telling me about the others," Nessa said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources. "All the women who died here, going back to the beginning. They're ready to testify." As if summoned by her words, new figures began to appear in the tobacco smoke, not Cherokee spirits this time, but the ghosts of Brock's more recent victims. They came hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, as they realized they were finally being seen and heard. A young Mexican woman who'd been traveling to meet her fiancé, a widow who'd been seeking work as a governess, a runaway who'd thought she was escaping one nightmare only to stumble into a worse one. Each spirit added her voice to the growing chorus of accusation, and with each testimony, the supernatural pressure around the ranch intensified. The land itself was rejecting Brock's presence now, the very soil turning acidic wherever his feet touched it. Plants withered at his approach, and animals fled in terror from his scent. Sheriff Hawkins, still at the ranch and growing more desperate by the hour, tried one last time to convince Brock to surrender. "It's over," he said, his voice cracking with strain. "Whatever's happening here, it's bigger than both of us. Let the women go, turn yourself in, and maybe what?" Brock's laughter held no humor, only the sound of a man whose sanity was hanging by threads. "You think territorial justice will be satisfied with putting me in prison? You think these things will stop just because I confess?" He gestured wildly at the supernatural manifestations surrounding them. The Cherokee settlement was now fully visible, its ghostly buildings occupying the same space as the ranch structures, in an impossible display of overlapping realities. Spirit warriors walked patrol routes that had been established before his great-grandfather was born, and medicine women tended fires that burned without fuel or smoke. "This is what we brought on ourselves, Tom," Brock continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. 3 generations of Henley men, taking what we wanted. When we wanted it, the debts come due, and they're not interested in installment payments. In the cellar, the sacred tobacco had burned down to glowing embers, but its work was complete. Nessa felt the full weight of her heritage settling around her like armor made of starlight and righteousness. She was no longer just herself, she was the vessel for every Cherokee woman who had died at Henley hands, the instrument through which their justice would finally be served. The rope around her wrists dissolved like morning mist, its work finished, now that her spiritual transformation was complete. The cell door swung open of its own accord, the iron bars no longer able to contain what she had become. As she stood, power flowed through her like electricity, and the bone whistle in her palm began to sing with voices that spanned generations. Maria crossed herself and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Gracias, Virgen Santissima. Justice comes at last. The time for hiding was over. The spirits had testified, the debt had been calculated, and the cosmic scales were ready to be balanced. As Nessa stepped out of her cell, the other women following behind her, the ranch house above them began to burn with cold fire that consumed evil, but left justice untouched. The final reckoning had begun. The war medal fell from Brock's trembling hands as the supernatural storm reached its crescendo, clattering across the parlor floor like an accusation made manifest. The tarnished bronze caught the light from the cold fires burning outside, revealing details that had been hidden beneath decades of careful polish and willful ignorance. Dr. Meridian, drawn to the ranch house by forces he couldn't resist, arrived just as Brock was staring at the medal in horrified recognition. The physician's trained eye immediately caught the significance of what lay before them, not just a Civil War commendation, but a detailed record of atrocities that military bureaucracy had tried to sanitize. Company K, 3rd Colorado Volunteers, Dr. Meridian read from the inscription, his voice barely above a whisper. Sand Creek, November 29th, 1864. The date hit both men like a physical blow. Sand Creek, the massacre that had become legend even among a frontier accustomed to violence. But this medal told a different story than the one recorded in official histories. Etched into the bronze with careful precision were coordinates, dates, and a list of crimes that made even hardened men sick to contemplate. Black Kettle's Village, Dr. Meridian continued, pieces of historical puzzle falling into place. But that's not where your great-grandfather was supposed to be. According to military records, Captain Samuel Henley was stationed in Cherokee Territory during that period. The supernatural energies swirling around the ranch suddenly shifted, focusing with laser intensity on the medal and the secrets it revealed. The Cherokee spirits that had been gathering strength all week now pressed closer, their translucent forms radiating an anger that had been building for nearly a century. In the cellar, Nessa felt the change like a punch to her solar plexus. The bone whistle in her hand grew so hot it nearly burned her fingers, and the sacred tobacco pouch began to pulse with light that hurt to look at directly. New memories flooded through her, not just her own ancestral heritage, but something darker and more complex. "My God," she whispered as the truth revealed itself through the spiritual connection. "We're not just Cherokee." Maria leaned closer, sensing the significance of what was being revealed. "What do you mean?" "The massacre at Sand Creek," Nessa said, her voice carrying the weight of inherited trauma. "Captain Henley didn't just kill Cherokee women and children. He was part of the unit that attacked the Cheyenne village too. My great-great-grandmother, she was Cheyenne, not Cherokee. She survived Sand Creek only to be murdered later when she tried to find sanctuary in Cherokee territory." The revelation recontextualized everything that had been happening at the ranch. This wasn't just about one isolated atrocity, it was about a pattern of violence that had spanned multiple tribes and communities. Captain Henley had been a specialist in killing indigenous women and children, a man who had turned genocide into a personal mission. But the war medal revealed an even more horrifying truth. Etched in tiny script around the edges were the names of his victims, recorded with the meticulous attention to detail of a man who took pride in his work. 53 Cherokee women and children, 47 Cheyenne, 32 Arapaho. The numbers went on and on, a ledger of death that represented hundreds of lives cut short by one man's twisted appetites. "He kept score," Brock whispered, the full horror of his inheritance finally becoming clear. The old bastard kept score like it was some kind of game. Dr. Meridian's medical training helped him recognize the psychological profile emerging from the evidence. "Serial killer," he diagnosed grimly. Before the term existed, before anyone understood what they were dealing with. Your great-grandfather wasn't just a soldier following orders. He was a predator who used the chaos of the frontier to feed his compulsions. The supernatural response to this revelation was immediate and overwhelming. The Cherokee spirits that had been haunting the ranch were suddenly joined by Cheyenne and Arapaho dead, their combined presence creating a spiritual maelstrom that threatened to tear reality apart at the seams. The ranch house began to buckle under the weight of so much accumulated grief and rage. In the cellar, Nessa's transformation accelerated beyond anything she could have imagined. She was no longer just channeling Cherokee power, she had become the focal point for justice that transcended tribal boundaries. Her skin began to glow with patterns that represented multiple native traditions, and her eyes reflected the combined wisdom of generations of medicine women from dozens of different communities. The curse isn't just Cherokee, she realized, her voice carrying harmonics from multiple spiritual traditions. It's a coalition. All the tribes he murdered, all the women he killed, they've been working together, waiting for someone with the right bloodline to serve as their instrument. Maria crossed herself again, overwhelmed by the scope of what was being revealed. A curse that powerful, it wouldn't just affect one man. It would follow his bloodline, getting stronger with each generation. Until it found someone strong enough to channel its full power, Sarah added, her practical mind grasping the implications. Someone with the spiritual DNA to serve as a living weapon of justice. The war medal on the parlor floor began to glow with malevolent light, its bronze surface showing not just the names of the dead, but their faces as well. Each victim appeared for a moment, looking directly at Brock, with eyes that held centuries of patience and the promise of retribution finally delivered. Sheriff Hawkins, who had been growing more desperate and erratic as the evening progressed, finally snapped under the psychological pressure. "This is insane," he shouted, pulling his pistol and pointing it at the medal as if bullets could somehow stop the supernatural reckoning. "It's just a piece of metal. It can't hurt anyone." But when he pulled the trigger, the bullet passed harmlessly through the medal and struck the floor beyond, leaving the bronze disc untouched and somehow more threatening than before. The spirits of Captain Henley's victims began to laugh not with humor, but with the terrible satisfaction of those who had waited so long for justice that they had forgotten mercy. Dr. Meridian, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was witnessing, found himself thinking about balance and equilibrium. "Energy can neither be created nor destroyed," he murmured, remembering basic principles from his university days. "All that pain, all that injustice, it had to go somewhere. It's been building up for 80 years, waiting for the right catalyst." In the cellar below, Nessa felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. She wasn't just the descendant of victims, she was the chosen instrument of a cosmic correction that had been decades in the making. The bone whistle, the sacred tobacco, the transformed rope, even the cattle brand that had revealed its true symbols. They were all part of an elaborate spiritual trap that had been closing around the Henley family for 3 generations. Brock was never really in control, she realized, her voice now carrying the authority of spirits who had transcended death itself. None of them were. They thought they were the hunters, but they were always the prey. The land, the spirits, the very universe itself, it's all been conspiring to bring them to this moment. As if responding to her words, the ranch house above began to collapse in on itself, not from structural failure, but from the weight of accumulated guilt and supernatural justice. The war medal rose from the floor of its own accord, floating in the air as it began to transform into something that belonged more to nightmare than to any earthly realm. The time for revelation was over. The time for judgment had begun. Above them, Brock's screams echoed through the night as he finally understood the true scope of what his family had unleashed. The curse hadn't just been about the Cherokee women his great-grandfather had murdered. It had been about every indigenous life that Samuel Henley had taken, every community he had destroyed, every family he had torn apart in his decades-long campaign of systematic genocide. And now, finally, the bill had come due in full. The spirit bundle began to form in Nessa's hands without conscious direction, each component appearing as if summoned from the very air around her. First came a lock of hair from the Cherokee woman who had died protecting her children, then a piece of fabric from the Cheyenne mother who had tried to shield her baby with her own body, a bone button from an Arapaho grandmother's dress, a shell bead from a Lakota medicine woman's necklace. Each artifact carried the spiritual essence of its owner, and as Nessa wove them together with threads that seemed to be made of moonlight and starfire, she felt the power of every murdered woman flowing into the bundle. This wasn't just a collection of objects, it was a weapon forged from memory, grief, and the unshakable certainty that justice delayed was not justice denied. Maria watched in reverent silence as the bundle took shape, recognizing the spiritual significance of what she was witnessing. Medicina Sagrada, she whispered. Sacred medicine. My grandmother told me about such things, but I never thought to see one created. The other women, Sarah and Jenny, pressed close to the bars of their open cells, drawn by forces they couldn't understand, but instinctively recognized as righteous. Even Jenny, whose mind had been shattered by months of captivity, seemed to find clarity in the presence of such concentrated spiritual power. It's beautiful, Jenny said simply, and for the first time in months, her voice carried no trace of madness or despair. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. The spirit bundle pulsed with inner light that grew brighter with each passing moment. As Nessa added the final component, a drop of her own blood, freely given, the bundle seemed to come alive in her hands. It hummed with energy that made her teeth ache and her bones sing, and she could feel the attention of spirits from across the continent, focusing on this moment like a lens concentrating sunlight. Above them, the supernatural storm was reaching its crescendo. The ranch house had become a battleground where reality itself was being rewritten. Dr. Meridian found himself pressed against the wall of Brock's parlor, watching in scientific fascination and human terror as the laws of physics bent around the accumulated spiritual pressure. Sheriff Hawkins had retreated to the farthest corner of the room, his pistol forgotten in his shaking hands. The lawman who had spent years taking bribes to look the other way was finally being forced to confront the consequences of his moral cowardice. The spirits of Brock's victims surrounded him now, translucent figures whose eyes held the weight of justice too long delayed. I didn't know, Hawkins whispered, though his words carried no conviction. I thought he was just rough with them. I never imagined. You knew enough, replied a voice that seemed to come from all the spirits at once. You knew enough to take his money. You knew enough to file false reports. You knew enough to let innocent women disappear without investigation. Brock himself had moved beyond panic into a state that might have been mistaken for calm if not for the way his hands shook and his eyes darted constantly toward shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The war medal lay at his feet, its bronze surface now showing a constantly shifting display of his great-grandfather's crimes in vivid, horrifying detail. What do you want? He asked the gathering spirits, though he suspected he already knew the answer. What will it take to make this stop? The response came not in words, but in images that flooded his mind, visions of every woman he had killed, every life he had destroyed, every family he had torn apart. The Cherokee women, the Mexican travelers, the desperate runaways, the innocents who had simply been in the wrong place when his appetite for violence needed feeding. But the visions showed him something else as well, the ripple effects of his actions spreading out like stones thrown into still water. Children who had grown up without mothers. Husbands who had searched for missing wives until madness took them. Communities that had learned to live in fear because monsters like him walked the earth with impunity. In the cellar, Nessa felt the final preparations falling into place like pieces of an enormous puzzle. The spirit bundle in her hands had become warm as living flesh, and she could feel the consciousness of every murdered woman awakening within its sacred geometry. They were ready to testify, ready to demand justice, ready to see the cosmic scales finally balanced. Dr. Meridian, his medical training warring with what his eyes were showing him, found himself thinking about the nature of trauma and healing. In my experience, he said to no one in particular, his voice steady despite the chaos around him, wounds that aren't properly treated don't heal. They fester, they spread. Eventually, they poison everything around them. As if responding to his observation, the spiritual energies in the house began to organize themselves into patterns that resembled the human circulatory system. The ranch had become infected with 80 years of accumulated violence, and now the universe itself was performing surgery to cut out the diseased tissue. The Cherokee spirits began to chant in their ancestral language, words that predated European contact and carried the weight of traditions that had sustained their people for millennia. The Cheyenne dead added their voices, then the Arapaho, then spirits from tribes whose names had been lost to history, but whose pain remained as fresh as the day they died. Nessa felt herself becoming the focal point for all this concentrated grief and determination. The spirit bundle pulsed in her hands like a heart made of justice and righteousness, and she could feel her ancestors, all of them, from every tribe, every tradition, lending her their strength for what was to come. "The bundle is complete," she announced, her voice carrying across distances that had nothing to do with physical space. "The witnesses are ready. The evidence has been gathered." Outside the ranch house, the very landscape began to transform. The Cherokee settlement that had existed here before the massacre materialized with increasing solidity, its buildings and gardens occupying the same space as Brock's structures in an impossible display of overlapping realities. Medicine lodges appeared where torture chambers had been built. Sacred fires burned where blood had been spilled. Gardens bloomed where graves had been hastily dug. The effect was disorienting and beautiful, like seeing a photograph of what the world could have been if genocide had never been allowed to take root. But it was also deeply unsettling, a reminder of just how much had been lost when men like Captain Henley had decided that some lives mattered less than others. Sheriff Hawkins found himself face to face with a Cherokee woman whose children he had helped Brock dispose of years earlier. The spirit's eyes held no hatred, only a terrible patience and the absolute certainty that justice would finally be served. "You have children of your own, Tom Hawkins," the spirit said, her voice carrying the authority of motherhood transcendent. "How would you feel if someone took them from you for sport?" The question hit the corrupt lawman like a physical blow. He did have children, 2 daughters and a son, and the thought of anyone harming them filled him with rage that threatened to consume his sanity. For the first time in years, Sheriff Tom Hawkins felt the weight of genuine remorse for what his cowardice had enabled. Dr. Meridian, meanwhile, had begun to understand his own role in the supernatural drama unfolding around them. "I'm here to bear witness," he realized, his scientific training finally finding common ground with the spiritual forces at work. Someone has to survive to tell the true story. Someone has to make sure the world knows what really happened here. In the cellar, the 4 women prepared for the final confrontation. The spirit bundle had reached its full power, containing the concentrated essence of every woman who had died at Henley hands across 3 generations. It hummed with energy that made the stone walls vibrate and caused their metal bars to sing like tuning forks. "It's time," Nessa said, though she wasn't sure if the words came from her own throat or from the dozens of spirits who had taken up residence in her consciousness. "The trial is about to begin." As she spoke, the cellar doors swung open of their own accord, revealing a stairway that led not just to the ranch yard, but to a courtroom where cosmic justice would finally be served. The spirit bundle blazed with inner fire, and Nessa felt herself transforming from victim to prosecutor, from prey to the instrument of divine retribution. Above them, Brock screamed as he felt the full weight of 3 generations of inherited guilt settling on his shoulders like a mountain. The war medal at his feet began to burn with cold fire, and the spirits of his great-grandfather's victims pressed closer, their translucent forms growing more solid with each passing moment. The time for judgment had arrived, and there would be no appeal from the verdict of the dead. The judgment stone rose from the earth with the slow majesty of a mountain being born. It emerged directly beneath the ranch house foundation, pushing through limestone and hard-pan clay, as if they were nothing more than morning mist. The ancient granite bore carvings that predated European contact by centuries, Cherokee symbols intertwined with Cheyenne pictographs and Arapaho medicine wheels, all bound together by spirals that seemed to move when viewed directly. Brock felt the floor buckling beneath his feet as the massive stone broke through, its surface glowing with the accumulated power of generations of spiritual energy. The ranch house, built on the bones of the Cherokee settlement, began to collapse around the rising monument, its walls crumbling like paper in the face of geological forces that obeyed laws older than physics. "What is that thing?" Sheriff Hawkins screamed, his voice cracking as he watched the judgment stone continue its inexorable rise toward the ceiling. Dr. Meridian, his scientific mind struggling to process what his eyes were showing him, found himself remembering fragments of anthropological texts he'd read in medical school. "Sacred stone," he whispered. "I've read about such things in ethnographic studies. Cherokee medicine men believed certain stones could serve as conduits between the world of the living and the realm of the dead." The stone's surface began to glow more brightly, its carved symbols shifting and rearranging themselves like living text. New images appeared, faces of the murdered women, scenes of the massacres, and most disturbing of all, a precise accounting of every life that had been taken by Henley men across 3 generations. Brock found himself drawn toward the stone despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. His feet moved of their own accord, carrying him closer to the ancient granite surface that now dominated the collapsing parlor. As he approached, the stone began to pulse with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, and he realized with growing horror that it was somehow connected to his very life force. "The spirits are calling court to session," came a voice that seemed to emerge from the stone itself. "The accused will present himself for judgment." From the cellar below, Nessa emerged carrying the completed spirit bundle, its power now fully activated and radiating energy that made the air itself shimmer. The other women followed: Maria with her curandera knowledge, Sarah with her practical wisdom, and Jenny, whose broken mind had been healed by proximity to such concentrated spiritual medicine. As they reached the main floor of the ranch house, they found themselves in a space that had been completely transformed. The judgment stone dominated the center of what had once been Brock's parlor, its massive bulk reaching nearly to the ceiling. Around its base, the spirits of the dead had arranged themselves in the pattern of a traditional tribal council, with the Cherokee women who had been murdered first taking positions of honor at the stone's eastern face. The war medal lay at the base of the judgment stone, its bronze surface now showing a constantly shifting display of Captain Henley's crimes. Each image was accompanied by the name and face of a victim, creating a visual testimony that left no room for denial or rationalization. Brock Henley. The collective voice of the spirits intoned, "You stand accused of crimes against the sacred order. You have taken lives that were not yours to take. You have brought dishonor to the very earth itself. How do you answer these charges?" Brock's massive frame trembled as he faced the assembled dead. For the first time in his life, his physical strength meant nothing. These were forces that couldn't be intimidated or overpowered, adversaries that had already experienced the worst he could do and emerged stronger for it. He began, but found himself unable to speak. The judgment stone was exerting some kind of influence over him, compelling truth in a way that made lies physically impossible. "I am guilty," he whispered, the words torn from his throat against his will. The spirits accepted his confession with the satisfaction of those who had waited decades for acknowledgement of their suffering. But confession alone was not enough. Justice required more than mere admission of guilt. It demanded balance, restoration, and the guarantee that such crimes would never be repeated. Nessa stepped forward, the spirit bundle blazing in her hands like a torch made of righteousness itself. As she approached the judgment stone, the carvings on its surface began to glow more brightly, responding to the presence of someone who carried the spiritual DNA necessary to channel the full power of ancestral justice. "The evidence is presented," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of every murdered woman who had ever called for justice. "The witnesses have testified. The accused has confessed. The judgment stone will now render its verdict." The ancient granite began to hum with a frequency that seemed to resonate in their very bones. Cracks appeared in its surface, not signs of damage, but deliberate fractures that allowed inner light to shine through. The stone was opening like a flower, revealing chambers within chambers, each one carved with symbols that told the story of cosmic balance and the price of restoring harmony to a wounded world. Sheriff Hawkins and Dr. Meridian pressed themselves against the far wall, overwhelmed by forces they couldn't understand, but instinctively recognized as final and absolute. The judgment stone had become a doorway between worlds, and through it, they could see the true scope of the spiritual reckoning that was about to unfold. The ancestors' war paint appeared on Nessa's face like brushstrokes made of liquid starlight, each mark carrying the spiritual authority of generations of Cherokee, Cheyenne, and Arapaho medicine women. The patterns were ancient beyond memory, symbols that spoke of justice, transcendent, and power that flowed from sources deeper than individual will or desire. As the paint settled into her skin, Nessa felt her consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of her individual identity. She was no longer just herself. She had become the living embodiment of every woman who had died at Henley hands, the vessel through which their combined will would finally be expressed in physical reality. Brock backed away from her transformed presence, his massive frame trembling like a child's. The woman who faced him now radiated power that made the air around her shimmer with heat distortion, and her eyes held the accumulated wisdom and righteous fury of spirits who had transcended death itself. "You cannot fight what I have become," Nessa said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources. "I am justice delayed but not denied. I am balance restored. I am the answer to prayers you thought no one would ever hear." The war paint on her face began to glow more brightly, its patterns shifting and flowing like living art. Each symbol told a story of lives cut short, of children who would never grow up, of families torn apart by violence that served no purpose beyond the gratification of twisted appetites. Brock lunged toward her with the desperate fury of a cornered animal, his massive hands reaching for her throat. But the moment his fingers made contact with her skin, the war paint blazed with light that sent him staggering backward, his hands smoking as if he'd touched white-hot metal. "You feel it now," Nessa observed with the calm detachment of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "The burning, that's the pain of every woman you've killed, concentrated into a single moment. That's what they felt when you took their lives." She advanced on him with deliberate steps, and everywhere her feet touched the ground, flowers began to bloom, not the cultivated varieties that belonged in gardens, but wild prairie flowers that had grown on this land before Europeans arrived. Each blossom carried the essence of a life that had been taken, a spirit that demanded acknowledgement. The judgment stone pulsed with increasing intensity, its inner chambers revealed now as a complex system of spiritual mechanisms that had been designed to deliver cosmic justice when earthly courts failed. The stone wasn't just a monument, it was a machine for balancing the universe's moral accounts, powered by the accumulated energy of righteous anger and operated by someone with the spiritual authority to channel such forces. Dr. Meridian, pressed against the far wall and scribbling notes with hands that shook from terror and scientific excitement, found himself thinking about energy conservation again. The pain had to go somewhere, he muttered, his physician's training helping him understand what was happening. All that suffering, all that injustice, it's been building up for decades, waiting for someone who could focus it into a coherent force. Sheriff Hawkins, meanwhile, was experiencing his own reckoning. The spirits of Brock's victims had surrounded him, their translucent forms pressing close as they demanded an accounting for his years of willful blindness. Each ghostly figure held evidence of his complicity, false reports he'd filed, investigations he'd refused to pursue, bribes he'd accepted in exchange for looking the other way. "We trusted you to protect us," whispered the spirit of a young Mexican woman whose disappearance he'd written off as voluntary departure. "We believed in the law you represented. How could you betray that trust for money?" The corrupt lawman felt tears streaming down his face as the full weight of his moral failures crashed down upon him. For years, he'd told himself that he was just trying to survive, just trying to provide for his family in a harsh and unforgiving world. But faced with the actual victims of his cowardice, those rationalizations crumbled like houses built on sand. Back at the Judgment Stone, Nessa's transformation was reaching its crescendo. The war paint had spread beyond her face now, covering her arms and hands with patterns that seemed to map the spiritual geography of injustice and retribution. Where the paint touched her skin, she felt the strength of every warrior woman who had ever defended her people, every medicine woman who had called down divine justice on those who harmed the innocent. Brock made one final, desperate attempt to assert physical dominance, charging at her with the fury of a wounded buffalo. But the war paint had transformed Nessa into something beyond the reach of mere physical violence. When his massive fist connected with her face, it was his own bones that shattered, his own flesh that burned, his own blood that spilled onto the ground where the Judgment Stone would drink it like an offering. "The sentence is death," Nessa announced, her voice now carrying the authority of cosmic law itself. "But not the quick death you gave to others. You will experience every moment of pain you inflicted, feel every tear your victims shed, know every prayer they whispered as they died." As she spoke, the Judgment Stone began to open like a flower made of granite and starlight, revealing chambers within chambers where spiritual justice would finally be served. The war paint on Nessa's face blazed with the light of truth made manifest, and the spirits of the dead pressed close to witness the moment they had waited 80 years to see. The peace pipe materialized in the space where Brock Henley had fallen, its carved stone bowl still warm from sacred fires that had burned in Cherokee councils long before the white man came to these lands. The pipe's wooden stem bore intricate carvings that told the story of balance restored and harmony reclaimed, symbols that seemed to pulse with gentle light in the aftermath of cosmic justice finally served. Nessa felt the war paint fading from her skin as the pipe appeared, its presence signaling that the work of retribution was complete. The spiritual energy that had transformed her into an avatar of justice was flowing back into the earth where it belonged, leaving her feeling simultaneously drained and renewed, empty and fulfilled in ways that defied easy explanation. She knelt beside the peace pipe with reverent hands, understanding instinctively that this was not just a ceremonial object, but a living symbol of the healing that could now begin. As her fingers closed around the carved stem, she felt the presence of her ancestors, all of them, from every tribe that had suffered under Henley violence, offering their blessing for the work ahead. Maria approached with careful steps, her curandera training helping her recognize the significance of what had transpired. "The spirits are at peace now," she observed, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had witnessed justice delayed but not denied. "I can feel it in the air. The anger is gone, replaced by something softer." Sarah and Jenny emerged from their hiding places behind the collapsed walls of the ranch house, both women moving with the tentative steps of those who had expected to die but found themselves unexpectedly delivered. Jenny's eyes, which had been clouded with madness and despair for so long, now held the clarity of someone whose sanity had been restored by proximity to sacred healing. "Is it over?" Jenny asked, her voice small but no longer broken. "Are we really free?" Nessa looked up from the peace pipe, her face now bearing only the faint traces of the war paint that had marked her as an instrument of cosmic justice. "It's over," she confirmed, and felt the truth of those words settling into her bones like a benediction. The debt is paid. The balance is restored. Dr. Meridian emerged from the rubble of the ranch house, his medical bag clutched in one hand and a notebook filled with observations in the other. The physician's scientific mind was still struggling to process what he had witnessed, but his healer's heart recognized the profound transformation that had taken place. "The land itself feels different," he said, gesturing toward the pastures where Brock's cattle had died in perfect circles just days before. "The air is cleaner somehow. Even the light seems softer." Indeed, the supernatural malevolence that had hung over the ranch like a poisonous cloud was dissipating with each passing moment. Where the Cherokee settlement had materialized in ghostly overlay, new grass was already beginning to grow, not the stunted, yellowed vegetation that had struggled to survive under the weight of accumulated injustice, but healthy prairie grass that swayed in breezes, that carried the scent of sage and sweetgrass. Sheriff Hawkins sat slumped against a broken fence post, his face streaked with tears and his badge lying in the dirt beside him. The corrupt lawman had been forced to confront the full weight of his complicity, and the experience had broken something fundamental inside him, not his spirit, but the elaborate structure of rationalizations that had allowed him to live with his moral compromises. "I have to make this right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how, but I have to try." Nessa studied his face with eyes that still held traces of the spiritual authority she had wielded during the confrontation. "You can start by telling the truth," she said simply. "All of it. Every bribe, every cover-up, every time you chose money over justice. The families of his victims deserve to know what happened to their daughters, their sisters, their mothers." Hawkins nodded, understanding that his career in law enforcement was over, but recognizing that this might be the first honest thing he'd done in years. "I'll write it all down," he promised, "every detail I can remember." As the group prepared to leave the ranch, the peace pipe began to emit wisps of sacred smoke, despite having no tobacco in its bowl. The smoke carried fragrances that spoke of healing and renewal, sage for cleansing, sweetgrass for prayers, cedar for protection. It rose in spirals that seemed to carry messages to spiritual realms, announcing that justice had been served and balance restored. The Cherokee settlement that had manifested during the supernatural confrontation was fading now, its ghostly buildings dissolving like morning mist. But its presence had accomplished its purpose. The land remembered its true history now, and that memory would protect it from future desecration. Dr. Meridian helped the women gather what few possessions they wished to take from their ordeal. For most of them, there was little worth keeping. The memories they carried would serve as testimony, but the physical reminders of their captivity could be left to burn with the rest of Brock's legacy. As they walked toward town, Nessa felt her mother's locket pulse one final time against her chest, then grow quiet with the peace of promises fulfilled. The silver pendant had served its purpose as a spiritual anchor, connecting her to the heritage that had ultimately saved not just her life, but the lives of countless future victims. The bone whistle, the sacred tobacco pouch, and the spirit bundle had all served their purposes as well, their power flowing back into the earth where it would sleep until needed again. The rope that had bound her wrists had dissolved entirely, its transformation complete now that her spiritual awakening was finished. Behind them, the remains of Brock's ranch began to burn with natural fire, not the cold flames of supernatural justice, but ordinary combustion that would reduce the buildings to ash and allow the land to reclaim what had always been its own. The judgment stone sank back into the earth with the same majesty with which it had risen, its work complete until some future injustice might call it forth again. As the sun set over Perdition Gulch, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the four women walked toward a future that held uncertainty but no longer held terror. They carried with them the knowledge that justice, though sometimes delayed, was never truly denied, and that the spirits of the dead would always be watching, ready to rise again if the living forgot the lessons written in blood and starlight. The peace pipe smoke continued to rise into the evening sky, carrying prayers of gratitude and promises that this sacred ground would never again be polluted by violence against the innocent. The healing had begun, and with it, the hope that some wounds, no matter how deep, could eventually be made whole again.